Okay, so we've noticed that arguments have two components to them. They have their content, what they're about, whether or not their premises are true, and they have their logical form, that inferential claim, the structural relationship between the content elements that either guarantees that if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true, or guarantees that if the premises are true, the conclusion is highly likely to be true if it's successful. And so we can think about these two components of arguments and how they work together using a couple of different metaphors. So one way to think about content and form in arguments and how they interact with each other is to think about content like a car. Right? So a car is the vehicle by which you get from point A to point B. And content is the vehicle by which you go from the premises to the conclusion, specifically from the truth of the premises to the truth or likely truth of the conclusion. So a car is the means by which you go from premises to conclusion. But in order for that content to work, you also have to have underlying logical form. Just like in order for your car to get you from point A to point B, you actually have to have roads. So it doesn't matter if your car is a Ferrari. If you need to cross a canyon and there's no bridge, there's no underlying logical form, then you're not going to get across. You're not going to get from point A to point B. So in order to have good transportation, you need both a car and you need roads. You need the vehicle and you need the structural components that facilitate its operation. Same thing with an argument. In order for an argument to work, you need content, the car, the vehicle, and you need underlying structural support. You need the logical form that facilitates it getting from premises to conclusion. Another metaphorical way to think about this relationship between these two components of an argument is to think of them in terms of a building. So all buildings have a facade. That is, they have a front, walls on the exterior that shield you from the elements, rain and wind and cold and heat, and that provide a thing for people to look at that is hopefully pleasing. Content in arguments functions like that facade. It's the thing that we actually see. It's the thing that we notice when we look at arguments. It's the thing that's easy for us to evaluate when we look at arguments. It's the stuff that's obvious. Okay? But in order for a building's facade to function, there has to be structural integrity underneath it. The building has to have a good frame. It has to have structural elements that hold up the facade, that unify the structure into one single, comprehensive, and integrated whole. And the same is true for logical form. All right? So we can have content that we can see and evaluate using our basic cognitive abilities, but that content needs to be connected in an underlying structural fashion such that the premises and their relationships to each other actually have implications for the conclusion and its truth or falsity. So content is like a building's facade. Logical form is like the underlying structural frame that holds it all together, that integrates it into a whole. So those are two metaphorical ways about thinking about these two components of arguments. And because arguments have two components, there are 2 points at which we can evaluate arguments as good reasons or not good reasons for holding a particular conclusion. So because arguments have both content and form, one point of evaluation, one way of determining whether or not an argument gives us good reason is to look at the argument's premises, the content. Right? Are the premises about what we want to make a conclusion about? Are the premises true? If the premises don't look like they're true, if the premises seem irrelevant to the conclusion, that undermines the content component of the argument. It renders the argument unsuccessful. Inferential claims, good logical structure, is only going to function to give you reasons to believe a conclusion if the premises are true and if the premises are actually about the things that you want to make a conclusion about. So inferential claims in and of themselves, they still need good content. They still need true premises. So it's important to realize that an inferential claim is just a claim about if the premises are true, when the premises are true, what will follow. It's not a claim that the premises are true. That's a content claim. And when we evaluate an argument, one point of evaluation is whether or not the content is good content. Is it true? Is it relevant to our conclusion? Is it about what we're thinking about? And so one way that we can criticize an argument is by questioning the argument's content, looking at its premises. The other way is to look at the argument's logical form. Now, looking at content is much easier for human beings. This is the sort of thing that drives our normal reasoning. We're concrete, contextualized reasoners. When we're reasoning, we're thinking about the specific objects that we're reasoning about. We're thinking about them in the specific context in which we're in. It's much more difficult for us to look at the underlying structural relationships that are present in an argument. And human beings are just pretty bad at this, so we need to put effort into doing it. But it's important for us to do it. So another point of evaluation for arguments is to look at their underlying structure. Is the inferential claim accurate? In the case of deduction, if the premises are true, does that guarantee that the conclusion is true? Or does the premises being true render the conclusion highly probable? So deductive inferential claim, inductive inferential claim. And if those claims aren't in fact good claims, if the logical form is defective, either the deductive logical form or the inductive logical form, then it doesn't matter how good our content is. It doesn't matter how relevant our premises are or whether or not they're true. They won't give us good reasons to think that the conclusion is highly likely or that the conclusion has to be true as well, unless that logical form, those underlying structural relationships between content elements are in place. And so true premises can only help when the inferential claim is true. So two components, content and form, and 2 points of argument evaluation, looking at the content and looking at the argument's form. So let's take that information about arguments and how they work and apply them to a particular case. So Rachel's talks about moral skepticism, and I have to introduce a little complication here because the way he talks about moral skepticism is a little, what do I want to say, careless. How's that? So strictly speaking, moral skepticism is a view about whether or not you can know whether something is morally good or morally bad. It's a question about our ability to know things, to have reasoned beliefs about things. And so the moral skeptic is going to deny that we can know moral truths. Not that there are moral truths, doesn't deny that. They're making what's called an epistemological claim. They're claiming that we're not ever in a position to know that things are morally praiseworthy or morally blameworthy, and so on. And it's easy to see why one might be tempted by this position when we think about how the world doesn't really come with tags. We don't see goodness or badness. We sometimes think we do. But, when I look at the behavior of someone, there's not a little sticker on the side of it that says morally praiseworthy. And there's not a little sticker that says morally blameworthy. And so people often look at that and say, hey, we can't know whether or not actions are good or bad because we have no way of measuring the existence or absence of such properties in the world. We don't see them, we don't smell them, we don't touch them, we don't have devices that measure them. So how could we know whether they're there or not? And so a moral skeptic makes a claim about what we can know. But people often conflate this, and Rachel's chapter kind of conflates this, with another position in morality, a position that has to do with ontology, about what there is. And that position is called moral nihilism. And moral nihilism doesn't make a direct claim about what we can know. It makes a direct claim about what is or isn't really existent. So moral nihilists deny that there are any moral truths at all. There are no moral properties. Actions are actions. They don't have the property of being morally praiseworthy or blameworthy. They don't have the property of being good or bad. They're just actions. Moral properties aren't real properties. So the moral nihilist claims. So the moral nihilist is making a claim about ontology, about what things there are in the world and how those things interact with each other. The moral skeptic is making a claim about what we can know. Can we know what moral properties a particular action or principle has? And so we want to separate those, even though Rachel kind of conflates them a little bit in this chapter. So when we think about moral skepticism, we can ask ourselves, well, what reasons would we have for accepting it as a truth about the nature of the world? Right? Is it really true that we can't know whether something is morally praiseworthy or blameworthy? And so we're going to want to look in the next lecture at arguments that Rachel offers up and evaluates for moral skepticism. And we'll stop here now and continue on in the last segment with a discussion of these arguments and Rachel's overall evaluation of them.